All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're tracing the intense, step-by-step journey of a patient on an ICU ventilator. We're going to decode these incredible machines that literally breathe for us when our bodies fail, and we'll break down the split-second, life-or-death decisions that medical professionals are making every single day. We're taking a high-yield, structured look at one of the absolutely most vital interventions in modern medicine.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going sequentially from crisis to recovery, starting with when to intubate, moving through ventilator basics, post-intubation care, monitoring lung health, key medical trials, and finally, the exit strategy.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, when to intubate. We really need to understand what exactly triggers the decision to put a breathing tube down a patient's throat.
Now, there's a highly confused medical dichotomy we've got to clear up right out of the gate. A patient can be hypoxemic without necessarily being hypoxic. Hypoxemia just means there's low oxygen content in the blood. Hypoxia, on the other hand, is a whole different beast. It means you're actually starting to see poor perfusion to the tissues and you're getting real end organ damage from that lack of oxygen. So picture a COPD patient. They might have an oxygen saturation of 88% and just be sitting there comfortably. They are hypoxemic, sure, but they aren't hypoxic unless their tissues are actively suffering and showing damage. It's an absolutely vital distinction to make in the ICU.
So beyond basic oxygen drops, there are 4 primary triggers that really force our hand to intubate. Acute hypoxemic respiratory failure is obviously one, but we also deal with acute hypercapnic respiratory failure. Think of a severe asthma attack where the patient just can't blow off carbon dioxide and is about to completely tire out. Then you have altered mental status, usually a Glasgow Coma Scale under 8. At that point, the patient simply can't protect their airway, meaning they're at a massive risk for a severe aspiration event. And finally, severe acidemia. These patients are breathing frantically to correct their blood's acidity, and without mechanical support, they will inevitably exhaust themselves.
Moving right along to Section 2, Mastering Ventilator Basics. Once the tube is in, we face the machine itself. Let's look at the actual dials and buttons.
Okay, this is absolutely crucial. You have to separate these concepts in your mind. If you need to blow off CO2, you have to adjust variables on the left, like tidal volume or respiratory rate. If your patient is becoming hypercapnic, meaning their CO2's shooting up to 80 or 90, you tweak those settings to help them ventilate it out. But if their oxygen levels are plummeting into the 70s, changing the respiratory rate is going to do absolutely nothing. To fix oxygenation, you have to look at the right side and modify the variables related to pressure and oxygen concentration, specifically the PEEP and the FiO₂.
Now, you're going to hear the term PEEP literally nonstop in the ICU, and understanding it is the absolute key to preventing lung collapse. PEEP stands for positive end expiratory pressure. Basically, even after the patient exhales, the ventilator maintains a small amount of continuous positive pressure. This makes sure the tiny air sacs in the lungs, the alveoli, stay slightly open instead of collapsing completely flat.
It's exactly like blowing up a balloon. You know how that very first breath takes an immense amount of force to get a flat balloon started? But once it's partially inflated, blowing it up the rest of the way is a total breeze. If the alveoli collapse entirely, they stop participating in gas exchange, a dangerous state we call de-recruitment. By applying PEEP, we're treating the lungs like that partially filled balloon. It's just incredibly safer and easier for the machine to inflate a lung that's already being held slightly open.
All right, on to Section 3, post-intubation care and the daily routine. The tube is secure, but honestly, the hard work is just beginning.
To build a solid safety net, ICUs rely heavily on the FAST HUGS BID checklist. It brilliantly chunks down a massive amount of daily care into one mnemonic. We make sure we're handling feeding, analgesia, and sedation. We prevent blood clots with thromboprophylaxis, keep the head of the bed elevated over 30 degrees to fend off pneumonia, and stay on top of ulcer and glycemic control. And this is huge, the sedation holiday. Waking the patient up daily to check their mental status actually helps get them off the ventilator much faster. We finish out by managing the bowel regimen, checking indwelling lines, and de-escalating antibiotics as soon as it's safe.
Which brings us to Section 4, Monitoring Lung Health. We need hard data to know if the patient is actually improving, right? Let's look at the pressures and ratios.
We use the Berlin criteria to instantly classify the severity of acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. We do this using the P to F ratio, which we pull from daily blood gases. It essentially compares the oxygen that's actually making it into the patient's blood against the raw oxygen the machine is pumping in. If that number falls under 300, you're looking at mild ARDS. Under 200 is moderate. And if it tanks to under 100, the patient is in severe ARDS. This simple math is how we track if the lungs are recovering over time.
Now pay really close attention to this dichotomy. You've got peak pressure and plateau pressure. A high peak pressure usually means there's an obstruction. It acts as an indicator of airway resistance. So if it spikes, you might be dealing with asthma or a COPD obstruction, but the lung tissue itself might still be fine. However, if the plateau pressure rises, that means the lung itself has lost its stretchiness. That represents a compliance problem deep down in the tissues, like pulmonary edema or ARDS, where the lungs are getting stiff and really hard to inflate.
And that brings us to the magic number 15. We absolutely want to keep the driving pressure, which is just your plateau minus your PEEP, under 15. The driving pressure tells us how aggressively the alveoli are stretching during gas exchange. If this climbs above 15, those tiny lung sacs are snapping shut and bursting open so violently that they could literally pop, causing terrible barotrauma, like a pneumothorax or a collapsed lung.
Let's dive into Section 5, 3 Practice-Changing Trials. Modern ventilator protocols are completely governed by the hard evidence from these massive studies.
The ARDS-NET trial is, without a doubt, a total game changer. It proves something pretty counterintuitive. Gentler breaths actually save lives, even if it means letting the patient's blood get a little acidic. It showed that using a lower tidal volume of 6 cc's per kilogram was vastly superior to the old standard of 12 cc's, mostly because it prevents volume trauma. By giving these smaller breaths, we intentionally let carbon dioxide build up a bit, a strategy called permissive hypercapnia. The protective benefit to the lungs from those lower pressures completely outweighs the temporary downside of mild acidity. Now, if that P to F ratio dips dangerously below 150, we have to pivot, and pivot aggressively. Enter the PROZEVA trial, which proved that flipping a patient onto their stomach, proning them for about 18 hours a day, radically improves outcomes. It shifts gravity, taking pressure off the massive amount of lung tissue at the back of the chest. And the ACURESIS trial showed that using paralyzing agents actually helps when the ratio is under 150. By completely relaxing the diaphragm, it takes away all muscle resistance and lets the ventilator do 100% of the work.
All right, the final stretch. Section 6, the exit strategy. We've stabilized the lungs. Now we face the highly delicate phase of safely weaning the patient off the machine.
So how do we get the tube out safely? It's a delicate 3-step dance. Step 1 is dropping the FiO₂ below 60%. This is absolutely crucial because prolonged high oxygen levels actually generate free radicals that cause toxic injury to the lungs themselves. Once the oxygen is at a safe level, step 2 is to slowly titrate that PEEP down. Finally, step 3 is conducting daily spontaneous breathing trials. We basically put the patient on a low-pressure support mode and let them test drive breathing on their own for about 30 minutes to see if they tire out.
And a huge part of those breathing trials revolves around the number of 105. This is the make-or-break threshold for the Rapid Shallow Breathing Index. If we divide the patient's respiratory rate by their tidal volume and get a number over 105, it means they're basically panting, taking fast, tiny breaths like a dog on a hot day. If they're doing that, they'll quickly exhaust themselves if we pull the tube too soon. It's a critical tool to make sure we aren't setting them up for failure.
Math aside, we've got to look at the physical signs before pulling that tube. We specifically check for a cuff leak to make sure the throat hasn't dangerously swollen. We deflate the little balloon on the endotracheal tube and listen. We want to actually hear an audible air leak and see a tidal volume drop of about 110 milliliters. If there's no leak, that means the airway is so swollen that pulling the tube could cause their throat to obstruct completely. We also look for a strong negative inspiratory force, meaning the diaphragm is strong, and we make sure the patient is awake enough to follow basic commands.
Looking at the overall timeline brings up a pretty grim reality. If a patient is stuck on this machine for 10 to 14 days, we usually have to surgically bypass the mouth with a tracheostomy. Leaving a plastic tube sitting through the vocal cords and trachea for that long will inevitably cause permanent, severe scarring, called tracheal stenosis, which is incredibly tough to treat. So around day 10 to 14, a tracheostomy provides a much safer, more permanent airway while we continue to try and wean them off.
Which really leaves us with this profound question. It's a fascinating look at the mechanics of survival, right? But where is the fine line between artificial life support and genuine medical recovery? Look, the ventilator buys us the most precious resource of all, time. It perfectly simulates the mechanics of breathing, managing pressures, getting oxygen into the blood. But at the end of the day, the machine itself cannot heal the underlying illness. It is entirely up to the patient's own biology to mend the tissue, recover that strength, and take over once the tube is finally removed. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope you found this breakdown of ICU ventilators as fascinating as I do. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.